The year was 1876 in the Dakota Territory, and the bell of St. Eliza's Church was ringing out over the town square. It wasn't a happy sound. Not today. It was the sound of a hammer falling, of a final judgment. Dust kicked up from 100 shuffling boots, and the air was thick with whispers. This was the day 7 suitors would claim their brides. The girls stood in a line, a row of stiff, starched dresses and nervous hands. Their hair was tied back with ribbons that had seen better days, their knuckles white as they clasped their hands in front of them, as if prayer was the only thing that could save them now. The town steward, a man built like a barrel with sweat stains blooming under his arms, held up a heavy leather ledger. He wasn't calling names. He was tallying livestock. One by one, the men stepped from the crowd. Some had pockets heavy with coin. Others had fathers nodding behind them, sealing the deal with a look. Each man walked down the line, his eyes scanning the girls, and then he would stop. He would place a heavy hand on a girl's shoulder, and a life would be decided. The first bride chosen was a girl named Elspeth. She cried when the man's hand fell on her, tears of pure relief streaming down her face. The crowd cheered as she clutched his arm, her future secured. She was safe. The second girl, younger, smiled so shyly her face nearly cracked. Her suitor was a good man, a farmer's son, and the women by the well murmured their blessings. The third was chosen, then the fourth, the fifth. Each selection was a sharp, quick blow, and with everyone, the shame at the far end of the line grew heavier. It coiled around the last girl standing there, a girl named Marble. She wasn't ugly, her face wasn't twisted by sickness or age, but you could see the hunger in the hollows of her eyes, and the sun had been too cruel to the skin on her cheeks. She was thin, wiry, like a weed that had fought its way up through hard ground. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was draped around her shoulders. It was a blue shawl, so faded by sun and time that it was nearly gray. The threads were worn thin, the edges frayed. It was the last thing her mother had given her, pressed into her hands with a fever-hot grip, right before the sickness took her for good. Marble would sooner cut off her own arm than part with it. But to the people of this town, that shawl was not a memory. It was a curse. They whispered about it in their kitchens. They muttered about it behind the church pews. The death cloth, they called it, a shroud. And no man, no matter how desperate, would dare touch a woman who wrapped herself in the grave. The sixth bride was chosen, a pretty girl who got a smattering of flowers tossed at her feet as her suitor led her away. And then there was only Marble. She stood alone at the end of the line, the dust settling around her worn boots. She clutched the faded shawl tighter, her heart pounding a frantic drum against her ribs. It was so loud she was sure the entire town could hear it, could hear her terror. A little boy, no older than 5, tugged on his mother's apron. His voice was as clear and sharp as the church bell. "Why is she still there, Mama?" His mother shushed him, her hand clamping over his mouth. But it was too late. An old woman standing next to them, her face a road map of wrinkles and scorn, muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Because no man wants what the grave has already touched." A single bark of laughter shot out from a corner of the crowd. It was coarse, ugly, and then it spread. It rolled through the square like a filthy wave, a thick, choking sound of mockery. Men slapped their thighs, women shook their heads with a kind of grim satisfaction, and children, seeing the adults, started pointing with cruel, merciless glee. Marble's lips trembled. She felt the hot burn of tears behind her eyes, but she would not let them fall. She would not. She lifted her chin, her jaw set, and stared straight ahead, even as the world blurred around her. The steward shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His neat and tidy ledger was now a mess. 7 suitors, 7 brides. That was the count. But this girl, this leftover, was spoiling his perfect math. He stomped toward her, his face red with annoyance, and slapped a heavy hand on her shoulder. It felt less like a touch and more like a brand. "Girl," he whispered, his voice sharp and low, "the choosing is finished. Step down. Step down now before you shame yourself even more." But Marble's feet didn't move. It felt like roots had shot down from the soles of her boots, burrowing deep into the hard-packed earth. She was part of the square now. She would not be moved. Did you not hear me? The steward hissed, his voice louder this time. The crowd leaned in, their eyes wide and hungry. They were waiting for her to break. They were desperate to see it. Still she stood. Her fingers were tangled in the frayed threads of her shawl. It was as if her mother's spirit had been stitched right into the fabric, and that spirit was now holding her spine straight and true. A drunkard's voice slurred from the saloon doorway. Look at her! Left like scraps no dog would even take. The crowd howled. The sound was a physical thing, a punch to Marble's gut. The 6 chosen brides were being led away toward the church now, for the blessing. They kept their eyes down, some with a flicker of pity, but most with a wave of cold relief that it wasn't them, that they weren't the one left standing in the center of all that hate. Soon they were all inside the church, all except Marble. She remained, a stark, lonely figure, against the fading afternoon sun. The old blue shawl seemed to glow in the dusty light. She didn't move. She didn't weep. She didn't yield. And the people, their laughter finally dying down in the face of her stubborn stillness, just watched. They waited. They watched to see how long a single person could stand before their own knees betrayed them and sent them crashing into the dust. The church bells had barely gone quiet when the laughter started up again. It was sharper this time, crueler, now that the happy spectacle of the chosen brides was over. Marble was the only show left in town. Some of the men crossed their arms, shaking their heads. They saw her stubbornness not as strength, but as insolence. An insult to them, that she wouldn't just scurry away and hide her shame. Others just smirked, leaning against porch posts, ready for the entertainment to unfold. A group of small children, bored and emboldened by their parents' scorn, started to circle her. They darted in and out, daring each other to get closer, their little hands scooping up pebbles and tossing them near her feet. Their high, piping voices were like tiny, sharp knives. "Why don't you cry, leftover?" one of them shouted. Another, a girl with mean eyes, added, "Because the dead can't weep." Their mothers watched from a distance, making no move to stop them. Scorn was a safe harbor. Defending the girl in the death shawl was not. One boy, braver than the rest, lunged forward. His dirty hand grabbed the edge of her blue shawl, and he gave it a sharp tug. Something inside Marble snapped. With a strength that shocked even her, she jerked the shawl back. Her eyes, which had been dull with shame, now blazed like hot coals in the growing twilight. The boy, startled by the fire in her gaze, stumbled backward and fell hard in the dust. The crowd didn't gasp. They didn't scold the boy. They roared with laughter. They twisted her act of defense into just another part of her humiliation. One of the suitors, the brother of the man who had claimed the prettiest of the brides, pushed himself off the post he was leaning on. He had a nasty sneer on his face. "You should be thanking the Lord you were spared, girl," he called out, his voice carrying across the square. "No man needs a curse warming his bed at night." The words were like a whip cracking against her skin. Marble forced herself not to flinch, but beneath the worn fabric of her shawl, her hands trembled violently. She squeezed her eyes shut for just a second, and she could hear her mother's voice. It was soft, but it was as unyielding as iron. "Dignity, Marble. It's worth more than all the silver and all the rings in this world." So she stood up even straighter. She lifted her chin a little higher. She fixed her gaze on the heavy wooden doors of the church, as if she, too, were waiting for a blessing. As if she belonged. Every whisper, every snicker from the crowd was another nail being driven into her skin, but she would not let them see her bleed. Hours crawled by. The sun bled out across the horizon, and long skeletal shadows crept across the square. Her knees were starting to ache, a dull throb that threatened to buckle. Still she stood. The townswomen gathered in small knots, their voices low and venomous. She was stubborn, they whispered, prideful, ungrateful for being passed over, as if she should be thankful for their scorn. The men muttered their own poison. No one wanted a woman cursed by her own bloodline. A toothless old man cackled, a dry, rattling sound. "Mark my word," he rasped, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "She'll still be standing there when the crows come to pick her bones clean." The crowd jeered at his grim prediction, but their eyes never left her. Her defiance was a strange fire in the dying light. and they were all moths, drawn to the spectacle, unable to look away. A boy started a chant, a cruel little rhyme. Leftover, got no one to love her. Soon, other children joined in, their voices a chorus of mockery ringing through the dusk. Each word was a hammer blow, but Marble held on. She clutched the shawl to her chest and whispered back to her mother's memory, "I will not bow, not tonight, not ever." A rancher passing on his way to the saloon paused and spat in the dust near her shoes. He didn't even look at her, just muttered to the air itself, "Someone ought to drag her away before she infects the rest of the town with that pride of hers." The steward was still there, shifting uncomfortably. He was torn. His duty was to clear the square. But his curiosity, his morbid need to see her finally break, kept him rooted to the spot. A man, his courage bolstered by a few swigs of whiskey, broke from the crowd. He swaggered right up to her and jabbed a dirty finger toward her face. "Go home, girl. The fair is over. You've shamed this whole town, lingering here like some damn ghost." Marble's lips parted. Her voice, when it came, was a trembling whisper, but in the tense quiet, it carried clear across the square for all to hear. "I will stand until the ground itself refuses me." For a single heavy heartbeat, there was silence. And then the laughter erupted again, louder and crueler than ever before. It was the sound of a pack of wolves tearing something apart. The steward's face was beet red. "Enough!" he barked, his voice cracking. "If she refuses to leave, she'll be dragged out by morning." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Some were amused by the threat. Others seemed a little unsettled at the thought of seeing her torn from her spot by force. The last of the daylight vanished completely, leaving only the flickering orange light of torches stuck in brackets along the church walls. Marble's shadow stretched out behind her, long and dark, and just as unyielding as she was. The laughter began to fade into tired murmurs. But just as a quiet calm seemed ready to settle, a man's voice rose up, cold and hard from the edge of the crowd. It wasn't the steward this time. It was someone else, someone promising to deliver what the steward had only threatened. "She'll be taken," the voice said, low and full of menace, "willing or not." Night fell on the square, like a cold, wet blanket. The wind picked up, whispering through the cracks in the wooden boardwalks beneath Marble's worn shoes. But she didn't move. She stood as still and rigid as if she'd been carved from stone. The torches along the church wall hissed and sputtered in the breeze, throwing her shadow tall and menacing against the weathered wood. Most of the crowd had drifted away, back to their warm homes and their supper tables. The show was getting old, but even with fewer eyes on her, the sting of their scorn lingered. Every insult they'd hurled clung to her like a burr, sharp and painful. A pair of young wives, their faces flushed with wine from the wedding feast inside the church, stumbled past. They were giggling, pointing openly at Marble. "She thinks she's better than us," one of them sneered, her voice a loud whisper, "standing there like a queen when no man even wants her." The other one leaned in close to her friend, her eyes wide with malicious gossip. "It's that shawl," she hissed. "Her mother died with it wrapped around her shoulders. Don't you know? That cloth carries the fever's curse." Marble's chest tightened. The words were a fresh stab of pain. But instead of loosening her grip on the shawl, she did the opposite. She drew it closer, wrapping it so tightly around herself that the frayed edges brushed against her lips. "It isn't a curse," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling but fierce. "It's the only blessing I have left." Her legs were screaming now, a deep, burning ache. Her back felt like it was about to snap in two. But she would not kneel. She would not sit. She would not give them the satisfaction. She closed her eyes and saw her mother's face in her final moments. The way her frail hand had pressed the shawl into Marble's arms. The final, whispered command. "Live with dignity, my girl. Even when the world spits on your name, you hold your head high." That memory was a fire inside her. It burned brighter than the hunger gnawing at her belly. It was steadier than the fear that threatened to swallow her whole. The square was quieter now, but not empty. A few men still lingered, leaning against the porch posts of the general store, mugs of ale in their hands. They watched her with a detached curiosity, the way a man might watch a stubborn mule that refuses to be broken. The boy who had mocked her earlier, the one she'd stared down, came back. He tossed another pebble. It bounced off the toe of her boot. She didn't even flinch. He grinned, a nasty, gap-toothed expression, and spat on the ground near her. "Ghost girl!" he yelled, then ran off into the darkness. His father appeared a moment later, cuffing him on the back of the head. "Don't you be saying such things," the man muttered, dragging the boy away. "Talk like that angers the spirits." And then Marble was left alone again, in the flickering silence of the torchlight. Hours bled into one another. The music from the wedding feast inside the church hall rose and fell on the night air. The sound of joyous laughter and the clinking of glasses drifted out, each note a cruel reminder that the chosen brides were celebrating while she was starving in the cold. Hunger was a physical pain now, a sharp clawing in her gut. Thirst was a layer of sandpaper in her throat, and still she stood. Her lips were pressed into a thin white line, her eyes locked on the church doors, as if she was still waiting for some kind of judgment. A woman, a friend of one of the brides, passed by on her way home. She paused, looked Marble up and down with a smirk, and whispered as she passed, "Better to lie down in the dirt, girl, than to clutch a shroud and pretend it makes you worthy." Marble's breath hitched in her throat. For a second her knees wavered, a wave of dizziness washing over her, but she held her ground. The fire behind her eyes burned away the weakness. She could almost hear her mother's voice on the wind, soft but unyielding. "You are worth more than all their laughter, my child. Stand tall until the dawn." And so she stood, hour after aching hour. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her spirit was hardening like iron in a forge. The torches began to gutter and die out, one by one. The square was nearly empty. It was then that a new sound cut through the silence. Heavy boots thudded on the wooden planks of the saloon's porch. It was the suitor's brother, the one who had sneered at her earlier. He stumbled out into the square, a half-empty mug still clutched in his hand, his grin wicked with drink. He swaggered toward her, his steps unsteady. He pointed at her with the mug, sloshing ale onto the dust. He slurred, his voice loud enough for the few remaining bystanders to hear clearly. "Still standing, are you?" He let out a drunken laugh that echoed in the empty square. "Well then," he said, his eyes glinting cruelly in the torchlight, "let's just see how long you last when someone finally puts you on the ground." The drunken man's laughter echoed across the square as he staggered closer and closer, his shadow dancing like a demon in the dying torchlight. A few of the townsfolk who were still lingering just watched. No one moved to stop him. No one said a word. Marble's pulse was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Her throat was tight with fear. Yet she stood her ground, her feet rooted to the spot, clutching the faded blue shawl like it was a shield. He reached for her, his dirty hand grabbing for her arm. But just as his fingers were about to close around her, the steward, his face red and puffy with either worry or wine, finally stepped in. He wasn't protecting her. He was protecting the town from a scandal. "The fair is ended," he barked at the drunk. "She has no right to be standing here any longer." The drunk grumbled, but he let his hand drop. He gave Marble a mocking bow, muttering under his breath that she wasn't worth the trouble anyway, and staggered back toward the saloon. The steward, now emboldened, turned his anger on Marble. With a grunt, he ordered her moved. Two men stepped forward, and while they didn't strike her, they shoved her, gently but firmly, across the square. They pushed her until her back was pressed up against the rough wooden steps of the church porch, right beneath the heavy shadow of the cross that topped the steeple. Just then, the church bells tolled the hour, and from inside the sound of the brides singing hymns drifted out through the closed doors. Their voices were sweet as honey, a beautiful, perfect harmony that served as a cruel counterpoint to her public banishment. Marble's chest burned with a fresh wave of shame, but her feet refused to budge from the porch. It was as if some part of her believed she belonged there, among the blessed, even if the doors were barred to her forever. A woman carrying a loaf of fresh bread passed by. She stopped, sniffed the air, as if Marble gave off a bad smell, and said loudly to her companion, "Better she stays outside. We don't want her bringing that curse into the Lord's house." The few people left in the square gathered in small knots, whispering. They talked about her pride. They shook their heads. Some of them were still laughing. A child, his face a mixture of curiosity and cruelty, pointed a finger at her. "Why doesn't the preacher make her go away?" he asked his father. The man grunted, his eyes on Marble. "Because maybe," he muttered, "maybe even God is waiting to see if she will fall." Marble wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders. The faded, scratchy threads were a strange comfort against her cheek. She whispered into the cloth, a promise to her mother's memory. "I will not give them the sight. I will not let them see me collapse." Inside the church, the music swelled as the brides and their new grooms danced in the warm glow of lantern light. Outside, Marble stood alone in the cold shadows of the torches. The rough wood of the porch pressed into her back. The hunger bit deeper. The thirst burned hotter. But the memory of her mother's face, pale and thin in her final hours, steeled her resolve. Dignity is not a gift that men grant you, Marble. It is a flame you carry inside yourself. Her legs trembled violently now. She stumbled just one step, her ankle giving way for a split second. The small crowd that remained saw it. A jeering voice cried out, "There she goes! She's faltering!" Marble straightened instantly, pressing her back hard against the wall. She clutched the shawl so tight her knuckles were bone white. She would not fall. The hours dragged on. The night grew thick with the sounds of the feast winding down. One by one, the torches sputtered and died, plunging the square into near darkness. Finally, the heavy doors of the church creaked open. The brides emerged, their veils lifted, their cheeks glowing with wine and joy. They walked hand in hand with their husbands, their new lives stretching out before them. Each one passed by Marble. Each one gave her a look, some of pity, some of disdain. One of them, the prettiest one, whispered to her new husband, loud enough for Marble to hear. "See? She still stands there, cursed and stiff with pride." Her husband glanced at Marble, then quickly guided his bride away, as if her very shadow might contaminate them. The old porch boards groaned under Marble's shifting weight. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges from sheer fatigue. But still, she would not leave. A man over by the saloon spat a long stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "She'll be found stiff as a board by dawn," he barked to his friends, "still clutching that corpse's blanket of hers." His words drew a fresh round of laughter, but underneath it, a strange hush had fallen over the square. No one could look away. The stubborn girl who simply refused to yield had become a spectacle of a different kind. And just as the last torch on the church wall burned itself out, leaving only the pale light of the moon, a child's voice rang out again. It was sharp and clear and achingly innocent, and it cut right through the mocking laughter. "Why doesn't she fall?" The child's question hung in the air long after the last of the laughter had died away. It echoed in Marble's ears, a question she was asking herself. Though her knees shook so badly she thought they might turn to dust, she steadied herself against a porch beam. She clutched the shawl. It felt less like cloth and more like an anchor, the only thing keeping her from being cast adrift and swallowed by the night. The air had grown bitter cold, and the stars overhead were like sharp chips of ice. The town was asleep now, all the decent folk tucked into their warm beds. The only ones left were the stragglers, drifting like ghosts between the saloon and the church steps. And one of those stragglers was the suitor's brother. He reeled out of the saloon again, but this time his face wasn't twisted in a drunken grin. It was twisted with rage. His eyes were red, his steps uneven as he stomped across the dusty square. He saw her silhouette against the faint moonlight on the porch. A harsh, ugly laugh barked out of him, a sound that froze the marrow in Marble's bones. "Still here?" he slurred, stumbling closer. His shadow fell over her, swallowing her whole. "What kind of fool are you?" His friends, still lurking in the saloon doorway, jeered and egged him on. "Go on, take her then," one of them shouted. "If no one else will have her." The man grinned a hungry, wolfish grin. He stretched out his hand, not to strike, but as if he were claiming a piece of property. The small crowd of drunks and night crawlers tensed. Some were too far gone in their drink to care, but others leaned forward, their eyes wide, eager for the spectacle to finally turn bloody. Marble's heart thundered against her ribs. She thought it might break right through. She pulled the shawl tighter, but he was too fast. He seized her wrist, his grip like a band of iron. He shook her like a rag doll. "You want to stand so proud?" he growled, his breath hot and sour in her face. "Then you can stand proud in my house." His words dripped with a malice that was far more terrifying than simple drunkenness. The crowd laughed, but it was a nervous, uncertain sound now. They could all sense it. The thin line between a cruel jest and real violence was about to be crossed. Marble gasped, yanking her arm, but he only tightened his grip, dragging her off the porch step and into the dust. In a surge of pure, desperate defiance, she cried out. Her voice was sharp as broken glass, and it sliced through the night, silencing even the drunks for a moment. "I would rather rot alone in this dust than bow to your hand," he snarled, his face contorting with humiliation. To be defied by her, the leftover, the ghost in front of his friends, it was more than his pride could bear. He raised his free hand high, his palm open, ready to strike her down and shatter her defiance in front of them all. Marble's breath hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hand crushing the fabric of her shawl as if she could pull her mother's spirit right out of the threads. She braced herself for the blow, the stinging crack that would brand her forever as broken. The crowd leaned forward. Some gasped, some grinned. They were all waiting to see the proud girl finally broken. But the blow never landed. Suddenly, from the darkness at the edge of the square, a voice rang out. It spoke in a language no one there understood, in Lakota. The words were steady, deep, and commanding, and the drunkard froze mid-swing, his hands suspended in the air like a guilty thief caught in a bolt of lightning. The Lakota words rolled through the square like thunder across the open plains. They were strange and sharp to the ears of the townsfolk, but they carried a weight, an undeniable authority that was heavy enough to stop the drunkard's hand in midair. For a single silent heartbeat, no one moved. The last torch sputtered in the breeze, making the shadows on the church wall dance and leap. Then a figure stepped out of the darkness and into the faint moonlight. He was tall, his shoulders broad as an axe handle. Two long, dark braids, woven with beads that caught the faint light, hung down his chest. His face was weathered, but his eyes were as steady and sharp as a hawk's. He didn't stride forward with aggression. He moved with a quiet, calm power that made the jeering men fall silent. The drunkard cursed under his breath. He dropped Marble's wrist as if her skin had suddenly turned red hot. He took a half step back, though his foolish pride kept his chin held high. "This is none of your affair, Injun," he spat, but his voice had lost its conviction. It trembled. The warrior didn't answer him in English. He didn't answer him at all. He simply reached out and set his hand firmly on the drunkard's arm, the one that was still raised to strike. He didn't shove it. He just lowered it, with a strength that was so effortless it needed no demonstration. Then, without giving the drunk another glance, the warrior turned his steady gaze on Marble. She was trembling, not with fear anymore, but with the aftershock of what had almost happened. She clutched her shawl to her chest, her knuckles white, and met his eyes with a look that was caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. The crowd began to murmur. They were restless now. His presence unsettled them far more than her defiance ever had. "He should leave," one of the women whispered, her hand instinctively going to the small cross she wore around her neck. "What business does he have in our square?" another man muttered. "Better to let the girl rot than have one of them meddling in our affairs." The steward, his face now pale and sweaty, tried to regain control. He shouted for order, his voice cracking, insisting that the girl had to be gone by dawn, whether she stood on her own 2 feet or not. But Marble, her strength bolstered by the memory of her mother's voice, just lifted her chin and said nothing. Her silence was more defiant than any scream she could have uttered. The drunken man, his pride in tatters, slunk back toward the saloon to nurse his wounded ego. But others in the crowd weren't finished. They started hissing warnings at the warrior, telling him his presence would only bring trouble down on his own head. Still, the warrior remained as silent as stone. He just stood there, watching Marble with a gaze that seemed to unsettle the night itself. More hours crept by. The last sounds from the feast inside the church faded into a quiet, drunken singing. And still Marble stood. though her knees wobbled with every gust of wind and her stomach felt like it was eating itself from the inside out. An old widow, one who had looked at her with something like pity earlier in the day, shuffled out from the edge of the crowd. She came close and whispered, her voice a hoarse rasp. "Child, go home. No shawl, no memory is worth what they will do to you when the sun comes up." Marble was too weary to speak. She just shook her head, a small, stubborn movement. The old woman saw the fire still burning in the girl's eyes and she sighed, stepping back into the shadows, a mixture of pity and fear on her face. The crowd started to chant again. Their voices were softer now, tired but still dripping with malice. They called her cursed bride. They called her unwanted ghost. They called her a prideful sinner. Marble ignored them. She fixed her gaze on the eastern horizon, where the first hint of dawn would soon break. The warrior's shadow never moved far from her. He stood like a silent sentinel, watching over her, though he did not speak another word. The steward, his patience finally gone, barked one last time. "If she remains when the bells strike dawn, she will be dragged away." The words had a chilling finality to them, and they were echoed by the grim nods of the men who were eager for the final, violent spectacle. Marble clutched her shawl so tight her knuckles ached. She whispered to her mother's memory a silent, desperate prayer. "I will not yield, not while I still have breath in my body." And though her spirit held firm, her body was beginning to betray her. Just as the last torch on the far side of the square sputtered and died, plunging them into deeper darkness, her knees buckled. It was only for a second, a slight, involuntary dip, but the crowd saw it. A collective gasp of delight rippled through them. She was finally about to collapse. Her knees buckled, and a raw, triumphant cry rose up from the darkness of the crowd. They had waited all night for this. This was the moment. But before she could collapse into the dust, a strong hand shot out and caught her elbow, steadying her, holding her upright. Gasps of a different kind now rippled across the square. In the faint pre-dawn light, they could all see him. The Lakota warrior was standing right at her side. His presence was no longer distant and watchful. It was right there, undeniable. He wasn't holding her the way a man claims a possession. He was holding her the way a soldier might steady a wounded comrade on the battlefield. His grip was firm, but it was respectful. Marble's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked up into his face. It was a face scarred by weather and hardship, but it was striking. And his eyes. His eyes were burning with a fire that wasn't mockery. It was recognition. The townsfolk hissed with outrage. Some of them clutched at the rosaries in their pockets. Others started muttering about the sacred ground of the church being defiled by his presence. The steward stormed forward, his face a mask of fury. He pointed a shaking finger at the warrior. "This is no place for you. She is our shame to deal with, not your concern." But the warrior didn't move. He didn't speak. He just turned his calm, steady gaze on the steward. There was such quiet authority in that look that the steward actually faltered in mid-step, his angry words dying in his throat. The drunkard who had tried to strike Marble earlier spat from the saloon porch. "No Lakota is going to steal what no white man even wanted," he shouted. The crowd laughed, but it was an uneasy, nervous sound, torn between their fear of the warrior and their anger at his interference. Still, the warrior remained as steady as a mountain. His shadow fell across Marble's trembling form, and it felt like a shield, protecting her from the crushing weight of their scorn. Marble clutched her shawl tighter. The frayed blue cloth felt warm beneath her hands. She whispered so quietly that even the wind couldn't hear it, "Mother, I am not alone." The words were a spark. They gave her a fresh surge of strength, just enough to straighten her spine once more. Though her body was screaming for rest, the crowd murmured, unsettled. Her defiance had been one thing, a thing they could mock and laugh at. But her defiance bolstered by his silent guardianship, that was different. What they had seen as foolishness was beginning to feel like a challenge. The steward, his pride wounded, bellowed that the dawn would decide her fate. He declared that when the bells tolled, she would be dragged away, and the warrior would be beaten if he dared to interfere. His words were meant to terrify them both into submission. But Marble felt no fear now. A strange, inexplicable calm had settled over her. It was as if the shawl she wore didn't just carry her mother's memory. It was as if it carried a shield of dignity, woven right into its frayed and faded threads. The hours slipped by. The last of the torches died. The stars began to fade from the sky, leaving the square bathed in the pale, ghostly light of the moon. The warrior never left her side. He spoke no words, but his silence was louder than all their jeers combined. A young boy asked his father why the warrior was just standing there. The man, glancing nervously at the calm strength in the warrior's posture, muttered, "Because sometimes even stone can see the worth that men are blind to." The first pale light of dawn began to brush the eastern horizon, painting the square in shades of gray. Marble swayed on her feet. The long, brutal night was carved into the lines of her face. Her legs were trembling like reeds in the wind, but she did not fall. She was being held up as much by her own spirit as by the silent presence of the man beside her. The steward, desperate to reclaim his lost control, raised his staff of office. He shouted for the men of the town to ready themselves. As soon as the church bells began to strike, they were to drag her from the porch, whether she was standing or clinging to the wood. The crowd stirred, restless. Some were eager for the violence to begin. Others looked uneasy. Marble braced herself for the brutal moment she had known, all along, was coming. And as the first, deep, resonant bell of dawn began to toll, the warrior at her side lifted his head. He spoke, his voice low and steady, in his own tongue. The crowd couldn't understand the words, but Marble felt them. She felt them in her bones. They were a promise that the hour of her judgment would not belong to them alone. The first toll of the bell rattled through the square, deep and heavy. It wasn't a summons to prayer, it was a summons to judgment. As its echo faded into the cold morning air, the steward lifted his staff high and barked, "Now! Take her now!" Boots shuffled in the dust. The men moved forward, hesitant but obedient. Some of them were eager to get their hands on Marble, to be the ones to finally drag her down. But others glanced uneasily at the tall Lakota warrior who stood like a stone pillar beside her. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken again. But his stillness carried more weight than all their jeers and threats combined. Even the boldest among them hesitated. Marble's knees trembled. Her whole body ached with a hunger and a weariness so profound it felt like it had settled in her bones. But she clutched her blue shawl tighter, wrapping it across her shoulders until the frayed edges crossed over her heart. She could almost hear her mother's voice, whispering from the threads, a reminder of a dignity that could outlive scorn. The crowd murmured as the steward bellowed again, ordering them to seize her. Two men finally broke from the group and stepped forward. They moved reluctantly, their eyes darting back and forth between Marble and the warrior. The warrior shifted his weight, just enough to place his body more fully between them and the girl. The torchlight was gone now, and in the pale gray light of dawn, his figure seemed less like a man and more like something carved from the earth itself. "Why does he even care?" a woman muttered from the crowd. "She's nothing." Another woman standing beside her whispered back, "Perhaps he sees what we do not." Marble, swaying but still unyielding, drew in a ragged breath. It was enough to speak. Her voice was raw, but it was clear. "I stand because I must," she said, her eyes sweeping over the faces in the crowd. "Not for you, not for him, but for her." She clutched the shawl. "And I will not bow." A ripple of gas went through the onlookers. No woman left unchosen, left to shame, had ever dared to answer back. But her defiance, with the warrior's silent watch at her side, struck them differently now. The steward, his face purple with fury, shouted for her to be dragged away. But the men hesitated again, muttering among themselves that it was bad fortune to lay hands on someone so stubborn, especially when she was being guarded by eyes that seemed to see right through them. The bells tolled again. The crowd leaned forward, a single hungry body, straining to see the breaking point. Inside the church, the last of the wedding hymns faded away. The brides, now blessed and wedded, emerged with their grooms. They walked out onto the porch, their happy laughter dying on their lips as they saw the scene before them. Marble still standing, the blue shawl across her chest, and the Lakota warrior, his shadow falling over her like a mantle of protection. One of the new brides whispered to another, Why doesn't he just take her already if he wants her so badly? The words, meant as a cruel jest, stirred through the crowd like a dry grass fire. A new murmur rose up, not of curses this time, but of a strange, uneasy curiosity. The warrior's eyes never left Marble, and in them she saw no pity. She saw only acknowledgement. It was as if her long, terrible night of standing had carved her into something new, something the rest of them could no longer ignore or erase. But the steward, desperate and cornered, was not finished. He cried out that if his men were too cowardly to drag her away, he would fetch the sheriff himself, and the sheriff would see her cast out of the square for good. The crowd stirred, and the drunkard from the night before, his face puffy and his eyes bloodshot, staggered out of the saloon again. He shouted that he would see her, humbled himself, if no one else had the nerve. He lurched toward the porch, his big hands balled into fists, his face twisted with a hateful rage. Marble gripped the shawl as the bells tolled a third time. Her body was shaking uncontrollably now, but her voice, when it came, rose steady and sharp. "You may break my body, but you cannot take this from me." She lifted the shawl, holding it high in the morning light. The crowd gasped as the drunkard lunged, but he never reached her. The Lakota warrior stepped fully into his path. He raised his hand, not in a threat, but in a clear, undeniable command. And the next strike, if it came, would not land upon her alone. The square erupted into chaos. The drunkard stumbled back from the warrior's silent, upraised hand, his pride wounded far more than his flesh ever could be. He bellowed like a wounded bull, turning to the crowd, his face pleading. "Will you let one of them shame us in front of our own church?" He roared, spit flying from his lips. His words were a spark thrown into the dry tinder of the crowd's anger and fear. Some of the men cheered him on. Some jeered at his cowardice. But many of them just hesitated, their eyes fixed on the sight of Marble, still standing, her faded shawl held high. The warrior's silent, powerful presence weighed heavier on them than the drunkard's blustering words. The steward, his face red with a fury that bordered on madness, barked that the girl had to be cast out before the final bell tolled. "No cursed shawl will linger on the porch of God's house," he shrieked. Two men surged forward, emboldened by the steward's rage and the drunkard's cries. They seized Marble's arms, but she twisted away from them, clinging to the shawl so fiercely that the ancient fabric nearly tore in her hands. A cry ripped from her throat, not of fear, but of pure, desperate defiance. "You will not take it from me!" In the struggle, she lost her footing. The crowd gasped as she fell to her knees in the dust. But even on her knees, she held the shawl aloft, her trembling arms raised toward the heavens like a desperate offering. The drunkard laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. He stepped in, his hand reaching down to snatch the shawl from her grasp. But before his fingers could touch the cloth, the Lakota warrior moved. He was as swift and silent as a storm gathering on the horizon. He planted himself between the drunkard and the kneeling girl. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he finally spoke in clear English. His voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the square. "She has stood longer, braver, and truer than any bride you cheered yesterday," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the men before him. "You touch her again, and you shame only yourselves." The words cut through the morning air like cold iron. A deep, profound silence followed, broken only by the restless shuffling of boots in the dust. Some of the men scowled, muttering about pride and trespass, but many others lowered their eyes because the simple, hard truth in the warrior's voice could not be denied. Marble, still kneeling, clutched the shawl to her chest. Her body felt broken with fatigue, but her spirit was burning brighter than the rising sun. The steward continued to rage, insisting that the sheriff would settle this. But no one moved, not even the drunkard, whose courage had completely withered beneath the warrior's steady, unwavering gaze. The murmurs swelled again as the final bell neared. The crowd was torn now, caught between their old familiar scorn and a new growing sense of awe. "She has endured what none of us could," a woman whispered, and her words struck the people around her like a hidden spark. Marble used the last of her strength to force herself upright again. She was staggering, but she was unbowed. The shawl was draped across her shoulders, a mantle of defiance. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her eyes were hollow with exhaustion. But she met the crowd's gaze, and her voice, though weak, was clear. "I am not cursed. I am my mother's daughter, and I will not fall." The warrior's hand hovered at her back, not touching her, but there, steadying her without controlling her. And for the first time, Marble felt the crushing weight of her burden being shared, not taken away. The drunkard, utterly humiliated, shouted one last time, "She's nothing! A leftover! A ghost!" But his words rang hollow now. They were drowned out by the thick, heavy hush of a people who were no longer laughing. And as the final bell of dawn drew in its breath, ready to toll, the steward, in one last, desperate attempt to assert his authority, raised his staff high to cast her out himself. But the Lakota warrior stepped forward. He seized the staff in mid-swing, and with a sharp, sudden movement, he snapped it clean in two across his knee. The sound cracked through the square like a bolt of thunder. The crowd recoiled in shock, and the last bell's note began to rise. The sharp crack of the staff breaking silenced the square, as surely as thunder silences birds in flight. When the last heavy note of the bell finally tolled, every eye was fixed on the Lakota warrior. He stood tall, the two splintered halves of the steward's staff cast at his feet in the dust. The steward himself stumbled backward, his face ashen, his authority shattered as completely as his staff. None of the other men dared to step forward now, not even the drunkard, whose bluster had finally withered and died beneath the weight of that single decisive act. Marble swayed on trembling legs, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The blue shawl was clutched across her chest like a banner won in a long and brutal war. Though exhaustion threatened to pull her down into the darkness, she remained upright. It was as if the roots of her mother's memory were holding her firm. The warrior turned, and his gaze met hers. There was no pity in his eyes, there was only recognition. It was as if, in her long night of humiliation, he had witnessed the forging of a spirit that could not be broken, a strength that no jeer, no hand, and no man's law could ever steal. Slowly, almost reverently, he reached for the shawl. His fingers brushed against the frayed edge. For a split second, Marble's instinct was to clutch it tighter, terrified that even this man would try to tear it from her. But he didn't take it away. Instead, he lifted it gently from her shoulders. He spread it wide, its faded blue a stark contrast to the gray dawn. And then he draped it across both of their shoulders, binding them together beneath its worn fabric as the crowd watched in stunned, absolute silence. A murmur rippled through the townsfolk. It was not a sound of laughter or of scorn this time. It was a sound of shame. Because what they had mocked as a curse, what they had called a death shroud, was now revealed to be a mantle of honor, a cloak of dignity that no man in their town could ever buy or bargain for. The newly wedded brides and their grooms standing on the church porch lowered their eyes. They were humbled by the sight of the one left unchosen, the one they had pitied and scorned, now being honored more deeply than any of them had been. Marble's tears finally fell. They were not tears of weakness or of sorrow. They were tears of release. Her voice broke as she whispered the words she had longed to say all night. "Mother, I have not bowed." The warrior's hand rested lightly on her arm. It was as steady as stone, and he spoke in English, his voice clear and strong, so that all could hear. "She stood when all others were chosen," he said, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "She stood when you called her nothing. I claim her, not as an act of pity, but as proof that true strength endures." His words rolled across the square, sinking deep into the hearts of those who had jeered. Some of them turned away, unable to meet his gaze, ashamed of their own cruelty. The steward, his face red and trembling with impotent rage, dared not speak. The broken staff at the warrior's feet was a silent, powerful warning. In that profound silence, Marble straightened to her full height. The shawl felt warm against her skin. It was no longer a relic of shame. It was a living bond, connecting her past to her future. She took a step forward, the warrior at her side. Each footfall on the dusty ground echoed like a judgment. The crowd parted before them, an uneasy, silent sea of faces. No one lifted a hand to stop them. The sun finally broke free of the horizon, and its first golden rays gilded the faded shawl with light. In that morning glow, the old threads seemed to shimmer, as if her mother's spirit was walking beside her, woven into the very fabric of her being. Together they crossed the square. They left behind the jeers, the shame, and the long, terrible night. Soon only whispers trailed after them. Some said she had been chosen by a curse. Others said she had been saved by chance. But Marble knew the truth. She had stood alone, and by standing, she had finally been seen. As the warrior guided her toward the open road that led away from the town, she pressed the shawl against her heart. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that it had carried her through the fire of humiliation and delivered her to a place of honor. It had guided her from solitude to strength until the world itself was forced to see her worth. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you had seen her still standing with only her mother's shawl for courage, would you have stepped forward too?